So there's a law, and throughout from time to time we'll be covering various laws in economics. So one of them is the law of diminishing marginal utility. What that says, as additional units are consumed, the next unit's worth less to a consumer in money terms. So as consumption increases, marginal utility declines. If you think through most products that you'd own, I think you'll find that this law really seems to make sense, right? If you have no shirts at all, literally nothing, that first shirt you would obtain is extremely important, right? It gives you clothing. So the first shirt is extraordinarily important. Now, if you only have one shirt, is the second shirt valuable to you? I would imagine it is, right? I mean, you go from only having one to now having two. Right? You could take one off, put the other on, clean the other one. That second shirt would be extremely valuable, but not as valuable as the first one, right? The first one you went from not having clothing to having clothing. Now you go from two outfits, much better. So third one valuable? Well, I'm guessing most of you have more than three shirts or sweatshirts. So yeah, I would think most of you think that's valuable. Even a fourth, fifth, even a 10th might be valuable. But each extra one you add on is probably a little bit less important to you than that initial one that you first would have gotten. Now, thankfully, most of you, if you're watching this, you were never in a case where you had no shirts. But if you imagine yourself in that case, I mean, I think that's something that's quite clear. Almost any product you can think of, this is going to hold, right? Space in a house, like square footage. You know, if you have a place that's relatively small, a little bit of extra space means a lot. If you have a place that's big, that same little amount of extra space might not be quite as important. It shouldn't be quite as important. I was challenged, think about this law of diminishing marginal utility. You see there's a Z point on this. Is definitely kind of a concept you really should know. Think about this law of diminishing marginal utility. Are there any counterexamples? I usually to try to see if there are. Some people have mentioned, and I think this is a good example where the law of diminishing marginal utility might not hold, is when there's addiction. There's kind of a separate economic theory on addiction, right? Like the first cigarette you might not like if you smoke a cigarette, but then if you start to get addicted, you might need more. That being said, even within the idea of addiction, this law probably holds, at least in some circumstances. Now, preface this by saying I am not a heroin user. I'm sure you're all shocked. But from what I understand, if you have gone without heroin for a couple days, the first, you really want, I don't know, a hit. I don't know what it's called, a hit, a shot. I know you inject heroin, but I really don't even know the term for it. But if you go without it for a couple days, you really want it. Just like with nicotine, if you are a smoker and you go without nicotine for an extended period of time, that first amount of nicotine you intake is extremely important. You're willing to pay a lot more for that first one than for the second one, right? It's a law of diminishing marginal utility. Second one still might be important, but not as important as that first amount. So addiction in ways still does satisfy this, but that's one case where it might not be. There probably aren't many you're going to be able to come up with, right? If you think of all of the various categories of products in the world, there aren't very many that you could come up with. But if you're looking for something, I mean, if you do a Google search, I bet you could find some people that have examples. If you're looking, it's not part of the class, but if this idea interests you, there's certainly ways you can look into this a little bit more. Okay, marginal utility analysis, the optimal purchase rule. We're going to be looking at marginal utility and comparing it to the price of a product. That will tell us how much the consumer should buy. So the term for this is marginal net utility, and that's simply the marginal utility minus the price. If the marginal net utility is positive, the consumer isn't buying enough of the product. If it's negative, it's not optimal, right? The marginal net utility should never be negative. Now we mentioned, in that chart, there's if you consume the fourth unit in the chart, you lost a quarter, it's negative 25 cents in value to you. I mean, it's not like you lost the money, but you felt worse off consuming the fourth unit. Well, marginal net utility is marginal utility minus price. Even if you're at an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? So that extra piece of pizza you ate cost you no money, you still wouldn't do it, right? Because your marginal net utility is negative. But what we can do with the marginal net utility is incorporate the price of the product and see what is the optimal purchase rule. So I want you to take a moment before I get to this, in about 10, 20 seconds or so, pause this. Go from our chart of marginal utility and total utility and assume a price of $1, a price of $1, and try to figure out how many units would our consumer buy in that example if the price was $1. Go ahead and pause it now. When you restart, we'll go through it together. Okay, I hope you paused it and attempted the question. At a price of $1, right, marginal net utility. Marginal utility is $2. Marginal net utility is $2 minus $1. $1. For the second unit, the marginal utility, the extra satisfaction you got from consuming unit number 2 is $1.25. Means the marginal net utility is a quarter. The third unit, the marginal utility is 50 cents. Well, if you have to spend $1, your marginal net utility is negative 50 cents. For the fourth unit, the marginal utility is negative 25 cents. It means the marginal net utility is negative $1.25. So how many units would this consumer purchase? They would buy 2, right? And this is the key thing. When figuring out what to buy, we look at marginal utility versus the price. The number one mistake on this example that you see is somebody will say, okay, price of $1, and they'll start to compare the total utility. And what they might think is at a price of $1, well, if they buy 3, they get a total utility of $3.75, cost them $3, they'll buy 3 units. That's not the right way to look at the question. Because the third unit, the consumer only gets an extra value of 50 cents. They have to spend $1, right? You'd never do that. You'd lose 50 cents in value. And indeed, if you spend $3 and you get $3.75 in satisfaction, what your total amount of satisfaction is 75 cents, right? $3.75 minus $3, $1 for each unit that you purchased. But if you only buy 2, you get $3.25 in satisfaction, and you only spent $2. Your total satisfaction is $1.25. It's 50 cents more than if you bought 3, which is this exact amount of the marginal net utility if you bought the third unit. It would be negative if you bought the third unit. So to figure out what you will purchase, right? There's 2 ways to do it. You could plot out the marginal net utility like we've done here. You stop before it gets negative, right? You do not ever purchase a product when the marginal net utility is negative. So you'd buy 2 units. The other way you could do it is just take the price of $1 and compare to the marginal utility. Marginal utility is $2, price is $1, we'd buy. Marginal utility is $1.25, price is $1, we'd buy. Marginal utility is 50 cents, price is $1, whoa, that's a bad deal. We would not buy it. We only get 50 cents in satisfaction from the third unit. It costs us $1, we wouldn't buy the third unit. So there's 2 different ways you could go about it. They'll both get you to the same answer. It's whichever one you're more comfortable with when you're conducting your analysis. Now we haven't hit demand curves yet. But when we do, this law of diminishing marginal utility is going to imply that our demand curves are downward sloping. The reason for that, as you start to buy more, your marginal utility drops. Because your marginal utility drops, that means that at a given price, you're less likely to buy that next unit. But as the price falls, you're more likely to purchase an extra unit. right? And that's indeed what we end up seeing in the demand curve. As the price falls, the quantity demanded the quantity demanded does increase, right? We talked about the law of diminishing marginal utility. Later, we'll talk about the law of demand. This isn't as crucial for this section. It's just kind of prefacing what we're going to see soon when we start to cover our demand and supply section. So these are intertwined, right? The diminishing marginal utility helps us get to the rationale for the downward sloping demand curves.